Hi, I'm Marcus Hutzel, and in this video I want to talk a bit about the main camera I use here for YouTube, a Panasonic GH5, and why I use it, even now in 2022, so that maybe this information can help you decide if it's the camera for you or if it's not. Or you can just make fun of me for staying on the Panasonic bandwagon and using a 5-year-old camera with terrible autofocus and not jumping on board with the latest and greatest cameras. But I find these types of videos helpful and entertaining to learn about how someone else got a particular look and what they used and what settings they had, etc. It's fun and it's a learning experience. Also, real quick here at the beginning, if you are a person that may be looking for a camera for filming videos like this or having virtual calls and like the look I'm getting, but you need to use and rely on putting the camera in autofocus, don't get the GH5. Autofocus on the GH5, as most of you know, is terrible, and it's been a long-running problem, as everyone knows. So if you don't want to take the time to manually focus or boot up the mobile app to remotely focus, no harm, no foul, you're free to move on to another video. But if you're interested in why I still use a GH5, then welcome, and we'll continue, and maybe you'll learn something. So here are a few of the main reasons I use a Panasonic GH5 still, and previously a Panasonic G9 to film YouTube videos and to use during virtual calls and important online meetings. Again, yes, even in the year 2022 when the GH5 is aging, at least by some people's standards, and when they've recently come out with a GH5 Mark II, but we're talking about the original Panasonic GH5. It still really is a great hybrid photo and video camera, but I use it mainly for video, so that's what I'm going to focus on here. And like any piece of gear, if you take care of it, it will last. I mean, 5 years from now, this or any camera will still produce the same quality as it's producing right now, and we've kind of reached a pretty good peak, maybe, of video quality. I won't say that video quality is at its best and can't get better, but it's currently pretty great across all manufacturers, so better at this point seems to be minor incremental changes and updates. So there's no excuse to have bad video quality because there's a camera at a price point for everyone. And I just really like using mirrorless hybrid style cameras like the GH5 for video. They're not for everyone, and there are probably easier options to use for a webcam for virtual meetings, but this is what I like using. And some of the points in this video are a bit long in the tooth, but I think the last reason that I have for still using a GH5 is the most important one, so stick around for my most important reason near the end, but we'll start at the beginning. So, the reasons I still use a Panasonic GH5 in 2022 boil down to, number one, the picture quality I get pretty much straight out of camera without having to fix a lot in post. The detail this camera captures is pretty fantastic, and the default built-in photo and color styles on the GH5 look great, and I use them mostly as is and don't have to spend a lot of time correcting things after I record. I normally just use the natural color setting and film in 24 frames per second, or 23.976, and I just use the 8-bit video codec. And since the image looks great with just the standard photo styles, that means my online meetings look just like this as well, making most of my coworkers a bit jealous, and also I look great in front of clients. The second reason I still use GH5, the finely tunable professional specs that this camera has that not many other DSLR or mirrorless cameras have, even some of the ones that have just hit the market. And in short, some of the higher end specs that I use are the waveform monitor, 10-bit video recording occasionally, true 24 frames per second frame rate, which I'm not using right now, but this camera can do a true 24 frames per second if you need it, and synchro scan. This comes in very handy if you want to have specific things in your video frame, like a TV back there, which I don't have on right now, or this little skull light. If you don't have synchro scan, things like TVs and different lights can produce flicker in your video, and synchro scan is one way to get rid of that flicker and have a clean image. I'll have to dive into some of the reasons I like these pro features in another video, so look for that as well. But I use the waveform monitor every time I film to check exposure, and as I said, I use synchro scan a lot even here in my small studio. Number 3, no recording time limitations. This is a big one, as a lot of cameras still have a 30-minute recording limit on them for some silly reason, but the GH5 does not have any time limits when recording. You can record on the SD card until it fills up or until you run out of power. Not so important when having a meeting, because usually you're not recording on the camera when having a meeting, but still important to me overall because I have definitely forgotten about the 30-minute record limit on my Sony a7 III and previously my Panasonic G9 and thought I was still recording, but I wasn't. because I went over the 30-minute limit and the camera stopped recording and I didn't know it. But the GH5 has been doing that for over 5 years, no time recording limits. And yes, a lot of newer cameras from Sony and Canon are starting to get rid of the arbitrary recording limits, but they still exist on a lot of these styles of cameras, so just be aware. Number 4, a Flippy Screen that flips all the way around so you can see yourself and your settings. This is kind of a must on any camera if you need to film yourself. I realize it's pretty basic, but a lot of cameras still do not have a fully articulating screen. Like my Sony a7 III, it only has kind of a flip up screen. And granted, this camera is a few years old now, and the newer Sony a7 IV and the Sony a7S III have fully flip around screens, and camera companies are starting to come around and adding this feature more and more, but if you're going to be the one in front of the camera, it's kind of a requirement, unless you want to add more equipment, more cost, and more complication to your setup. Number 5, the wireless connectivity and control abilities when you connect to the camera's internal Wi-Fi network and use the Panasonic Image app with your iPhone or iPad, like I'm doing right now. Seriously, the Panasonic Image app gives you so much control over almost every setting on the camera, so you can change those settings and start and stop recording without having to reach up and mess with the camera and have to fiddle around with all the buttons. Not a lot of other manufacturers give you this much control from an app. Number 6, and probably one of the main reasons I like using a GH5, is the ability to remotely focus using the iPhone or iPad app, simply by touching the area on the iPhone or iPad app where you want it to focus. This is huge for me since I film myself usually by myself.
Allow myself to introduce myself.
Again, this is a feature not a lot of other cameras have, the ability to set your focus point remotely and have the camera actually focus on that point using an app. The older app for my Sony a7 III, you cannot remotely focus this camera with the app. I'm pretty sure on the new Sony a7 IV and a7S III you can do that, but I don't have those cameras. I'm not necessarily stuck with this, but it's a camera I'm gonna stick with for a while, so I can't remotely focus this thing, whereas I can remotely focus the GH5. And again, for those of you out there that just don't know, the GH5 autofocus is not great, so I just don't use it. If you're looking for a simple camera that you can just turn on and trust the autofocus, look elsewhere. But I just prefer setting manual focus most of the time when I'm sitting here at my desk because I'm usually not moving from my chair that much, so there's no reason for the camera to be on autofocus mode most of the time. And again, since my Sony doesn't allow that, I can't use it. This camera has great face detection autofocus, but if you're recording in 4K, the face detection can turn off depending on the settings you have. So I don't use this one a lot because it just offers less flexibility than the GH5. And the app for this particular camera, the Sony a7 III, the app lags. It kind of stutters and waits, whereas the GH5 app is really nice and smooth. I barely get any stutters or jitters on it, and it's just easier and better to use. The Panasonic app really just completely outshines most of the other apps that I've used for your cameras. And lastly, and I think the most important reason I still use a GH5 is that it's the camera I have, or at least one of them, obviously, since I do own 2 cameras, the GH5 and my Sony a7 III, but again, I don't use the a7 III that much for video in this space, mainly because of the previously mentioned lack of ability to remotely focus using the app, and honestly just not always wanting to use autofocus. I don't mind setting manual focus and just knowing that that area is in focus and I don't have to worry about it. And of course, because my Sony a7 III doesn't have a flip out screen, so when I'm filming myself, I can't really see what's going on unless I add more expensive equipment or some sort of little mirror hack to go on top of this so I can actually see what's going on. That's ridiculous, but often required. Because self-filming means you have to completely trust the camera. Now, do I trust Sony's face detection autofocus? Yes, but if I need to use other features like having an external monitor or having Wi-Fi on, the face detection turns off, so I can't rely on it. Do I trust the GH5 when I put it in manual focus and remotely focus on my face? Yes, I do trust it. My Sony camera aside, I'm also just a fan of using the tools that you have instead of always getting the newest and probably more expensive toys. Yes, again, Sony has recently put out some newer, great cameras with really great autofocus and flippy screens, the whole bit. But for me right now, that would require another expensive camera purchase or trying to sell one of these cameras, and I've just never gotten spectacular resale prices on selling my gear, The amount I'd get for selling one of these cameras wouldn't cover the cost of a new camera. And don't get me wrong, inefficient or subpar tools can definitely prohibit you from actually accomplishing the task you set out to do, so you never want the tools to really get in your way and keep you from creating. But these cameras work fine for what I need. They're great, despite their own drawbacks, because it's not always about the tools themselves, but what you do with those tools, what you build, what you create. And I have a lot of content that I want to create, and there's nothing wrong with my tools. A bad craftsman blames their tools. And if you can't make great content with your equipment, it's probably not your equipment. Good advice, even for myself as I navigate my own content. I think this point is important because I know as well as anyone that gear alone does not make you a better creator. So practice using the tools at your disposal instead of using it as an excuse to not create something. So for me, those are my top reasons for still using a Panasonic GH5 in 2022. It produces a great image, it has a lot of tweakable and professional features, I like using it, and it's easy to use when connected to the app on my iPhone here or my iPad. All of my reasons make it a great camera for me. It makes it easy for me to sit down and get recording without too much fuss. And I'll probably dive a little deeper into how I use some of these features in a separate video or maybe videos. So look for those if you want to know a bit more about how I use some of these features and what they can do for you. So use the tools you have, get better at your craft, and I don't think you can ever go wrong with that advice. And that's my advice for the day. So that's it for this one. We'll see you later.